The grand ballroom of the Crystal Palace Hotel buzzed with excitement as wealthy guests in designer gowns and expensive suits mingled around elegant tables. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the charity fundraiser, and the gentle clink of champagne glasses mixed with polite conversation. Tonight was the annual Music for Hope Charity Gala, raising money for underprivileged children to receive music lessons. At the center of it all stood a magnificent black grand piano, its polished surface reflecting the sparkling lights above. The evening's star performer, Alexander Blackwood, adjusted his pristine white bow tie one final time before taking his place at the bench. He was everything you'd expect from a world-class pianist. Tall, perfectly groomed, with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Alexander had been playing piano since he was 4 years old. His wealthy parents had hired the best teachers money could buy, and he'd spent his entire life being told he was exceptional. At 32, he had performed in the most prestigious concert halls around the world. Critics praised his technical perfection, and his album sales spoke for themselves. Tonight, like every night, he expected nothing less than complete adoration from his audience. As the room gradually quieted, Alexander placed his hands on the keys. He had chosen one of the most challenging pieces in classical music, Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. It was a piece that demanded not just technical skill but emotional depth, yet Alexander approached it like a mathematical equation to be solved rather than a story to be told. His fingers moved with machine-like precision across the black and white keys. Every note was exactly where it should be, every trill perfectly executed, every crescendo precisely timed. The audience watched in respectful silence, impressed by the sheer difficulty of what they were witnessing. This was clearly a master at work. But in the back corner of the room, at a small round table tucked away from the main crowd, sat a woman who seemed out of place among all the glamour. She wore a simple navy blue dress that looked like it came from a department store rather than a designer boutique. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore no jewelry except for a small silver watch on her wrist. While everyone else in the room sat mesmerized by Alexander's performance, this woman, let's call her Maya, remained perfectly still, her expression thoughtful but not particularly impressed. She didn't gasp at the difficult passages like the other guests. She didn't lean forward in anticipation during the dramatic moments. She simply listened, her trained ear picking up something that the others were missing. Maya had come to the charity event for one reason only, to support the cause. She had scraped together enough money to buy the cheapest ticket available, because she believed deeply in giving children access to music education. She had changed into her best dress after finishing her shift at the community center where she worked and had taken 2 buses to get to this fancy hotel. As Alexander played, Maya found herself thinking about her own students, kids from tough neighborhoods who came to her after-school program with eager faces and calloused hands. She taught them on an old upright piano that was missing several keys and hadn't been tuned in years. Yet somehow, when those children played, even simple songs like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, there was something magical about it. There was joy, there was hope, there was life. What she heard from Alexander's performance was undeniably skillful, but it felt cold and calculated. It was like watching someone paint a perfect copy of the Mona Lisa without understanding why people found the original so captivating. Every note was correct, but the soul was missing. Alexander finished with a flourish, his hands lifting dramatically from the keys as the final notes echoed through the ballroom. The audience erupted in enthusiastic applause, rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Alexander stood and bowed deeply, soaking in the adoration he felt he deserved. His eyes swept across the crowd, taking in the admiring faces and expensive evening wear. These were his people, cultured, wealthy, sophisticated enough to appreciate true artistry. But then his gaze landed on Maya, still seated at her table in the back, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She wasn't clapping. Alexander's smile faltered slightly. In a room full of people celebrating his brilliance, this one woman sat unmoved. He tried to brush it off. Perhaps she didn't understand classical music. Perhaps she was distracted by something else. But as he made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and praise, His eyes kept drifting back to that corner table. After 20 minutes of handshakes and compliments, Alexander couldn't stand it anymore. His curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself walking toward Maya's table. She was quietly sipping a glass of water and reading through the program, studying the information about the charity they were supporting. "Excuse me," Alexander said, his voice carrying the polished tone of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "I couldn't help but notice you didn't seem to enjoy the performance." Maya looked up, surprised to find the evening's star performer standing beside her table. She hadn't expected him to notice her, let alone approach her. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to be rude. Your playing was very impressive." "Impressive?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. The word felt lukewarm, especially coming after all the glowing praise he'd received from the other guests. "That's an interesting choice of words." Maya shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She could sense that she had somehow offended him, though that hadn't been her intention. "I mean, your technique is absolutely flawless. I've never heard anyone play those difficult passages so cleanly." "But," Alexander prompted, sensing there was more to her assessment. Maya hesitated. She wasn't the type of person to seek conflict, especially with someone so clearly important at an event like this. But there was something about his expectant expression that made her feel like he genuinely wanted to know what she thought. "But," she said carefully, "it felt like you were playing the notes rather than the music, if that makes sense. The piece you chose, Chopin's Ballade, it's supposed to tell a story about love and loss and hope. It should make people feel something deep in their hearts." Alexander's jaw tightened. This woman, who clearly didn't belong in a room full of society's elite, was critiquing his interpretation of a piece he had performed hundreds of times. The audacity was almost amusing. "And I suppose you think you could do better?" he asked, his tone becoming noticeably sharper. Maya shook her head. Quickly, No, that's not what I meant at all. I'm sure you have much more training and experience than I do. I was just sharing what I felt when I listened." But Alexander was already feeling his pride wounded. He had spent his entire life being told he was extraordinary, and now this nobody in a cheap dress was suggesting his playing lacked emotion. The conversation was attracting attention from nearby tables, and he could feel other guests starting to watch their exchange. "What do you do for a living?" he asked, his voice taking on a condescending edge. "I work at a community center," Maya replied honestly. "I help run after-school programs for kids." Alexander almost laughed out loud. Here was a community center worker, probably making barely above minimum wage, trying to give him advice about musical interpretation. The irony was too much to bear. Alexander felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. The idea that this community center worker thought she could critique his performance was beyond insulting. He had studied at the world's most prestigious music schools, performed for royalty, and earned standing ovations in concert halls that most people only dreamed of entering. Yet here she was, sitting in her discount dress, suggesting that his playing lacked something essential. The worst part was that other guests were starting to notice their conversation. He could see heads turning at nearby tables, champagne glasses, pausing halfway to lips as people strained to hear what was happening. This was supposed to be his night of triumph, another successful performance to add to his impressive reputation. Instead, he found himself being questioned by someone who probably couldn't even afford to attend events like this regularly. "So, let me understand this correctly," Alexander said, his voice getting louder despite his attempt to maintain composure. "You work with children at a community center, and you think that qualifies you to judge the performance of someone who has dedicated their entire life to mastering classical music?" Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She hadn't meant for their conversation to become confrontational, and she certainly hadn't expected him to announce her job to anyone within earshot. Several wealthy guests at surrounding tables were now openly staring at them, their expressions ranging from curious to amused. "I never said I was qualified to judge anything," Maya replied quietly, hoping to diffuse the tension. "I was just sharing my personal reaction to the music. Everyone experiences art differently, don't they?" But Alexander was past the point of reasonable discussion. His pride had been wounded in front of people whose opinions mattered to his career. Music critics, wealthy patrons, and influential donors were all watching this exchange, and he felt like he was losing control of the narrative. Personal reaction, he repeated with a bitter laugh. That's rich. You know what I think? I think it's easy to criticize when you're sitting safely in the audience. It's much harder to actually get up there and perform at the level that these people expect and deserve. The ballroom had grown noticeably quieter around them. Conversations at nearby tables had died down as more and more guests became aware of the drama unfolding in the back corner. Maya wished she could disappear into her chair, but Alexander seemed determined to make this a public spectacle. You talked about emotion and storytelling, Alexander continued, his voice now carrying clearly across several tables. You said the music should make people feel something deep in their hearts. Well, if you're such an expert on emotional performance, why don't you show us how it's done? Maya's eyes widened in alarm. Oh no, I couldn't possibly. No, I insist, Alexander interrupted, standing up straighter and projecting his voice. Even more. By now, at least half the ballroom was watching their exchange. If you're going to sit there and critique my interpretation, the least you can do is demonstrate what you think proper emotional playing looks like. The suggestion sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Nothing livened up a charity gala like unexpected drama, and the prospect of seeing this ordinary-looking woman attempt to follow Alexander's virtuosic performance was too entertaining to resist. That's not necessary, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. I really didn't mean to offend you. Your playing was technically perfect, and I'm sure everyone here appreciated it. But Alexander was beyond backing down now. His reputation felt like it was on the line, and he needed to prove his point decisively. Are you afraid? He asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Is it easier to criticize from the sidelines than to actually step up and perform? A murmur went through the crowd. Some people seemed uncomfortable with Alexander's aggressive tone, while others were clearly enjoying the unexpected entertainment. Maya felt dozens of pairs of eyes on her, and she wanted nothing more than to quietly slip out of the ballroom and disappear into the night. I didn't come here to perform, she said, trying one last time to extract herself from the situation, gracefully. I came to support the charity and the children's music program. How convenient, Alexander replied sarcastically. The critic doesn't want to put her money where her mouth is. The crowd was fully engaged now, sensing blood in the water. Maya could hear whispered conversations around the room as people speculated about what would happen next. She felt trapped, knowing that refusing Alexander's challenge would make her look foolish, but also terrified of the prospect of playing in front of such an intimidating audience. Mrs. Wellington, the charity event's organizer, appeared at their table looking flustered. She was a well-dressed woman in her 60s who had clearly been alerted to the situation by concerned guests. Is everything all right here? She asked, though her tone suggested she was more worried about maintaining the event's dignified atmosphere than genuinely concerned about the conflict. Everything's fine, Alexander said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I was just inviting this young lady to share her musical talents with us. She seemed to have some interesting opinions about tonight's performance. Mrs. Wellington looked between Alexander and Maya, clearly trying to assess the situation. As the event organizer, she needed to keep her star performer happy, but she also didn't want any unpleasant scenes that might reflect poorly on the charity. Well, she said diplomatically, I'm sure our guests would love to hear more music, but we don't want to put anyone on the spot who isn't prepared to perform. That's very thoughtful of you, Maya said gratefully, seeing an opportunity to escape. I really should be going anyway. Nonsense, Alexander interjected smoothly. Look around the room. Everyone's interested now. It would be a shame to disappoint them. He was right about one thing. The entire ballroom seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. Maya could feel the weight of their expectations, their curiosity, and perhaps their eagerness to see her fail. Besides, Alexander continued, this is a charity event. I'm sure people would be happy to make additional donations if they were entertained by an impromptu performance. Isn't that right, everyone? A few guests nodded and murmured agreement, though Maya couldn't tell if they were genuinely supportive or just caught up in the moment. The peer pressure in the room was becoming overwhelming. "If she plays," called out someone from across the room, "I'll donate another $1,000 to the children's program." "Make it 2,000, shouted another voice. Soon, several guests were calling out donation amounts, turning Maya's potential performance into an impromptu fundraising opportunity. Alexander smiled triumphantly. He had effectively cornered her. How could she refuse to play when it meant turning down money for the cause she claimed to care about? Maya felt her heart racing as she looked around the room at all the expectant faces. These people lived in a different world than she did, a world of designer clothes, expensive cars, and vacation homes. They were used to being entertained, and now she had somehow become their evening's amusement. The children's program could really use the money, Mrs. Wellington said quietly, though there was an undertone of encouragement in her voice. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about her students back at the community center. Kids like 8-year-old Tommy, who walked 2 miles after school just to attend her music classes, or 12-year-old Lisa, who saved her lunch money for weeks to buy a used recorder. They deserved every opportunity she could help provide for them. When she opened her eyes, Alexander was watching her with a satisfied expression. He clearly expected her to either refuse and look selfish or accept and embarrass herself trying to play at his level. Either way, he would be vindicated. "All right," Maya said softly, her voice barely audible over the excited murmur of the crowd. "I'll play something, but only if all the donations go directly to the children's music program." The room erupted in applause and excited chatter. Alexander's smile widened. He had won. As Maya stood up from her table, her legs felt shaky beneath her. The entire ballroom seemed to blur around the edges as hundreds of eyes focused on her every movement. She had never imagined that a simple evening supporting charity would turn into this kind of public spectacle. Her heart hammered against her chest as she slowly made her way toward the grand piano at the center of the room. Alexander stepped aside with an exaggerated bow, clearly enjoying his moment of triumph. He was certain that whatever this community center worker played would pale in comparison to his flawless technical performance. Perhaps she knew some basic children's songs or simple melodies, but there was no way she could match the complexity and sophistication he had just demonstrated. The wealthy guests shifted in their seats, champagne glasses forgotten as they prepared to witness what many assumed would be an embarrassing amateur performance. Some felt genuinely sorry for Maya, thinking Alexander had been too harsh in pressuring her to play. Others were simply curious to see how this unusual evening would unfold. Maya reached the piano bench and paused for a moment, running her fingers lightly along the smooth wooden surface. This instrument was worth more than she made in 2 years. A beautiful piece of craftsmanship that deserved to be played with respect and care. She had only played on pianos this fine a handful of times in her life, and never in front of an audience like this. She sat down slowly and adjusted the bench height, her movements careful and deliberate. Unlike Alexander's confident strut to the piano, Maya's approach was humble and reverent. She placed her hands gently on her lap and closed her eyes for a moment, seeming to gather herself. "Take your time, dear," called out an elderly woman from the front row, her voice kind but slightly condescending. "We're not expecting anything too complicated." A few people chuckled softly at the comment, and Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She knew that most of the audience saw her as someone who was about to make a fool of herself. Alexander stood off to the side with his arms crossed, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had already won the argument. Maya opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to do. These people expected failure from her, and part of her wondered if they were right. Maybe she should just play something simple and safe, get through this ordeal with minimal embarrassment, and let Alexander keep his pride intact. But then she thought about her students again. She remembered the look of wonder in their eyes when she played for them on their old, broken piano. She thought about the way music could transform their entire demeanor, how kids who came in angry or sad would leave her classes with smiles on their faces. Music wasn't about impressing wealthy donors in fancy ballrooms. It was about touching hearts and connecting souls. Maya placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the ballroom, but not as anyone had ever heard it before. Maya wasn't playing the orchestral version that required a full symphony. She was playing a solo arrangement that somehow captured all the power and emotion of the original composition. The first few measures were soft and contemplative, like a whispered prayer. Maya's fingers moved across the keys with surprising confidence, and even those guests who knew nothing about classical music could sense that something special was happening. Alexander's smug expression began to falter as he recognized the piece. This wasn't some simple children's song or amateur-level composition. This was one of the most challenging and emotionally complex pieces in the classical repertoire, and she was playing it from memory without sheet music. As the melody developed, Maya's playing began to reveal layers of emotion that took the audience completely by surprise. Where Alexander's performance had been technically perfect but emotionally cold, Maya's interpretation was like watching someone's heart pour out through their fingertips. The music swelled and danced, telling a story of love and loss, hope and despair, triumph and tragedy. Maya's entire body moved with the rhythm, not in a showy or dramatic way, but as if the music was flowing through her very soul. Her eyes remained closed, and a peaceful expression crossed her face as she lost herself completely in the performance. Teacher. Wealthy guests who had been chattering and whispering just moments before now sat in stunned silence. Several women dabbed at their eyes with elegant handkerchiefs as the melody reached deep into their hearts and stirred emotions they hadn't felt in years. Alexander stood frozen, watching his entire worldview crumble before his eyes. This wasn't just good playing. This was extraordinary. Maya's technical skill was flawless, but more than that, her interpretation was bringing tears to people's eyes. She was doing exactly what he had failed to do in his own performance. She was making the music come alive. As Maya played, Alexander began to notice things about her technique that he had missed before. Her hand position was perfect. Her fingerwork was incredibly precise, and her understanding of the piece's structure was sophisticated and nuanced. This wasn't the playing of an amateur community center worker. This was the playing of someone who had received serious high-level training. The piece moved into its most challenging section, a passage that Alexander himself found difficult to execute cleanly. He watched in growing amazement as Maya navigated the complex runs and intricate harmonies with effortless grace. Her playing was so smooth and natural that she made the incredibly difficult look easy. But it wasn't just her technical ability that was stunning the audience. Maya was telling a story through the music, and everyone in the room could feel it. The melody spoke of a young woman's first love, the joy of new romance, the pain of separation, and the bittersweet memory of what once was. People who had come to the gala thinking about business deals and social networking found themselves transported to their own memories of love and loss. Mrs. Wellington, the event organizer, stood with her mouth slightly open, completely mesmerized by what she was witnessing. She had organized charity galas for over 20 years and had heard hundreds of professional musicians perform, but she had never experienced anything quite like this. Alexander felt a sinking sensation in his stomach as he realized that Maya wasn't just a better musician than he had expected. She might actually be a better musician than he was. The thought was almost impossible for him to accept. His entire identity was built around being exceptional, being the best, being worthy of admiration and praise. As the piece continued, more and more guests began to openly weep. The music was reaching places in their hearts that had been locked away behind walls of wealth and social expectations. Maya's playing was reminding them of what it felt like to be truly human, to feel deeply, to be moved by beauty rather than impressed by status. A distinguished older gentleman in the front row, who had been checking his phone during Alexander's performance, now sat with tears streaming down his cheeks. A young couple near the back held hands tightly, remembering their own wedding day. Even the waitstaff had stopped their work to listen, standing along the walls with expressions of wonder on their faces. Alexander looked around the room and saw something he had never achieved in all his years of performing. He saw an audience that was completely transformed by music. These people weren't just impressed or entertained, they were deeply moved. They were experiencing something profound and meaningful that would stay with them long after the evening ended. Maya continued to play, completely unaware of the effect she was having on the room. She was lost in the music, in the story it told, in the emotions it expressed. This was why she had fallen in love with the piano in the first place, not for applause or recognition, but for moments like this when music became a bridge between souls. As Maya entered the final movement of the concerto, something magical happened in the ballroom. The piece reached its most emotionally intense section, where the melody soared to incredible heights before diving into depths of raw human feeling. Maya's fingers seemed to fly across the keys without effort, as if the piano itself was singing through her touch. Alexander watched in complete shock as Maya executed a passage that he had always struggled with. It was a section that required not just technical skill, but an understanding of musical phrasing that took years to develop. Yet she played it as naturally as breathing, with an interpretation that was both powerful and deeply personal. The elderly gentleman in the front row, a retired music professor who had taught at the conservatory for 40 years, leaned forward in his chair. He recognized something in Maya's playing that most of the audience couldn't identify. This wasn't just talent. This was the kind of musical mastery that came from years of serious study and practice. But more than that, it was the rare gift of being able to communicate pure emotion through music. Maya's performance was reaching its climax now, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The melody built to a crescendo that filled every corner of the ballroom, but it wasn't loud or overwhelming. Instead, it was like watching a sunrise, gradual, beautiful, and absolutely breathtaking. Her playing had a quality that professional musicians spent their entire careers trying to achieve. Alexander felt his legs grow weak as the terrible truth began to dawn on him. This wasn't just someone who could play piano well. This was someone who understood music at a level that he himself had never reached, despite all his training and accolades. Maya wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was channeling the composer's very soul and sharing it with everyone in the room. The society ladies who had been gossiping earlier now sat in stunned silence, mascara streaking down their cheeks. The businessmen who had been checking their phones were completely absorbed in the performance. Even the teenage sons and daughters who had been dragged to the event against their will were staring at Maya with expressions of wonder. But it was more than just the technical brilliance that was affecting everyone so deeply. Maya's playing told a story that everyone could understand, regardless of their musical background. It spoke of dreams pursued and dreams lost, of love found and love mourned, of the courage it takes to hope when everything seems hopeless. It was the soundtrack to the human experience itself. Alexander noticed that Maya's technique was flawless, in ways that his own playing sometimes wasn't. Her touch was perfectly controlled. She could make the piano whisper like a gentle breeze or roar like thunder, and everything in between. Her timing was impeccable, her phrasing was sophisticated, and her musical instincts were absolutely brilliant. Mrs. Wellington found herself thinking about her own daughter, who had given up piano lessons years ago to focus on more practical pursuits. Listening to Maya play, she wondered if she had made a mistake in not encouraging her child to continue with music. There was something about this performance that made her realize how much beauty and meaning could be lost when people abandoned their artistic dreams. The piece was building toward its famous ending now, the section that required incredible technical skill and emotional control. Alexander had performed this ending himself many times, and he knew how challenging it was. He watched Maya approach it with growing amazement, realizing that she was about to attempt something that only the world's finest pianists could pull off successfully, and then she did it. Maya's fingers danced through the complex final passages with such grace and power that several people in the audience gasped audibly. But it wasn't just the technical achievement that was stunning. It was the way she made every note meaningful, every phrase purposeful. She wasn't showing off her skill. She was completing the story she had been telling through the music. Alexander felt something break inside his chest as he watched Maya play. All his life, He had believed that his technical perfection made him superior to other musicians. He had looked down on performers who prioritized emotion over precision, thinking they were covering up their weaknesses with sentimentality. But watching Maya, he realized that true greatness came from combining flawless technique with genuine emotional depth. The final notes of the concerto rang out through the ballroom, held by the piano's sustained pedal until they faded into perfect silence. For a moment, nobody moved. The entire room seemed suspended in time, as if everyone was afraid that speaking or even breathing might break the spell that Maya had cast over them. Maya slowly lifted her hands from the keys and opened her eyes. She looked surprised to see the sea of faces staring back at her, as if she had forgotten that anyone else was in the room. During her performance, she had been completely transported to another world, a world where music was the only language that mattered. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then suddenly, the retired music professor in the front row began to clap. But these weren't the polite, measured applause that had followed Alexander's performance. These were slow, deliberate claps that seemed to come from deep in his soul. One by one, others in the audience began to join him. But instead of the typical enthusiastic applause you might expect, this was something different. People were clapping as if they were in church, with reverence and awe. Many were still crying, unable to process what they had just experienced. Alexander stood frozen as the applause gradually built around him. He had expected to feel vindicated when Maya's performance ended, ready to graciously accept her inevitable failure. Instead, he felt like his entire world had been turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew about music, about performance, about what it meant to be truly great, had been challenged in the span of 20 minutes. The applause continued to build, but it was unlike anything Alexander had ever heard. People weren't just showing appreciation for a good performance. They were expressing gratitude for having witnessed something truly extraordinary. Several guests were on their feet now, but they weren't whooping or cheering. They were standing, in respect, in recognition of something sacred that had just taken place. Maya remained seated at the piano bench, looking slightly overwhelmed by the response. She had played because the children's program needed the money, not because she wanted attention or acclaim. The intensity of the audience's reaction seemed to surprise and even embarrass her. Alexander watched as people began to approach the piano, not to congratulate Maya on her performance, but to thank her for what she had given them. He saw wealthy socialites wiping tears from their eyes as they spoke to her in hushed, reverent tones. He saw grown men struggling to find words to express what they had felt during her performance. But perhaps most devastating of all, Alexander began to overhear fragments of conversations around the room. People were comparing Maya's performance to his own, and the comparisons were not flattering to him. They spoke of how her playing had moved them to tears, while his had left them impressed but untouched. They talked about the difference between playing music and becoming music. Standing there in his expensive tuxedo, surrounded by the world he had always felt he belonged to, Alexander realized that he had never felt more alone or more humbled in his entire life. Maya had shown him what true musical greatness looked like, and it was nothing like what he had imagined. The applause finally began to die down, but the emotional atmosphere in the ballroom remained thick and powerful. Maya stood up from the piano bench, smoothing down her simple dress, and tried to make her way back to her table quietly. But the crowd wouldn't let her disappear so easily. People kept approaching her, some with tears still fresh in their eyes, others with expressions of pure amazement. "That was absolutely incredible," whispered an older woman who had introduced herself as a former opera singer. "I haven't been moved like that by music in 20 years. Maya smiled graciously, but seemed uncomfortable with all the attention. "Thank you, but really I just play for enjoyment. The important thing is that we're all here to support the children's music program." Alexander watched this interaction from a distance, still trying to process what had just happened. As more people gathered around Maya, he began to overhear conversations that made his stomach sink even deeper. "Did you hear her play that final section?" one music critic was saying to another. "That level of interpretation doesn't come from amateur lessons. That's conservatory-level training, maybe even beyond. The technique was flawless, replied his companion, but it was the emotional depth that really got me. I've reviewed hundreds of concerts, and I've rarely heard anything that powerful. Alexander felt increasingly invisible as the evening's attention shifted completely away from him. People who had been praising his performance just an hour earlier were now talking as if Maya's playing had erased all memory of his own contribution to the evening. Mrs. Wellington approached Maya with a checkbook in her hand, looking slightly stunned. My dear, I don't know who you are or where you learned to play like that, but tonight's donations have already exceeded our wildest expectations. People are writing checks for amounts I've never seen at these events. It was true. Inspired by Maya's performance, the wealthy guests were opening their wallets in unprecedented ways. The original challenge to raise money for the children's program had turned into a massive fundraising success, with donation amounts that would fund music education for years to come. I'm so glad the children will benefit, Maya said softly. That's all that really matters. But the retired music professor who had started the applause wasn't satisfied with Maya's modest responses. He approached her with a puzzled expression, clearly trying to solve a mystery that had been bothering him throughout her performance. Excuse me, young lady, he said gently, but I have to ask, where did you study? Your interpretation of that Rachmaninoff piece was extraordinary, but more than that, your technique suggests years of serious classical training. Maya hesitated, looking uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I studied music a long time ago, she said evasively, but that's all in the past now. The professor persisted, his curiosity getting the better of him. That arrangement you played, it's not the standard version that most pianists learn. It's a very sophisticated adaptation that captures the full orchestral sound in a solo performance. I've only heard it played that well a handful of times in my entire career. Alexander moved closer, despite himself drawn into this conversation. Something about the professor's tone suggested there was more to Maya's story than anyone realized. The last time I heard that particular arrangement played with such mastery, the professor continued thoughtfully, was about 15 years ago. There was a young pianist who won several major international competitions, but then suddenly disappeared from the classical music world. She went by her initials, MC, and people used to say she had the most naturally gifted musical interpretation they'd ever heard. Maya's face went pale and she took a step backward. I think there's been some misunderstanding. I really should be going now. But the professor's eyes lit up with recognition. Wait a minute. MC. Maya Chen. That's you, isn't it? You're Maya Chen, the pianist who won the International Chopin competition, the Van Cliburn competition, and the Rubinstein competition all in the same year. You were being called the greatest young talent of your generation. A hush fell over the group of people surrounding Maya. Even those who didn't follow classical music closely recognized these as some of the most prestigious piano competitions in the world. Winning even one of them was a career-defining achievement. Winning all three in a single year was almost unheard of. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. Maya Chen. He knew that name, even though he had tried to forget it. 15 years ago, when he was just starting his professional career, Maya Chen had been the rising star that everyone was talking about. She had been hailed as a once-in-a-generation talent, the kind of musician who came along maybe once every 50 years. And then, at the height of her success, she had simply vanished. No one knew why. There had been rumors and speculation, but Maya had refused all interviews and had never performed publicly again. The classical music world had mourned the loss of what many considered their brightest star. You gave up everything, the professor said quietly, his voice filled with awe and sadness. You were on the verge of becoming one of the greatest pianists in history. Why did you walk away? Maya looked around at all the faces staring at her, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure cracked. Because I realized that competitions and concert halls weren't why I fell in love with music, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I watched too many talented young musicians burn out from the pressure, lose their joy, become obsessed with perfection instead of beauty. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I met a little girl at one of my concerts. She was maybe 8 years old, and her grandmother had saved for months to buy tickets. After the show, she told me that my music made her feel like she could fly. That's when I realized what music was really supposed to do. It's not about impressing critics or winning awards. It's about touching hearts and giving people hope. Alexander listened to these words and felt something fundamental shift inside him. For his entire career, he had been chasing the very things that Maya had walked away from. The awards, the recognition, the admiration of his peers. He had believed that these external validations made him successful, but standing here now, he realized how empty his achievements felt. So you chose to teach children instead? Mrs. Wellington asked, her voice filled with respect. Maya nodded. I work with kids who come from neighborhoods where most people think classical music isn't for them. I try to show them that music belongs to everyone, that it can be a source of strength and joy regardless of your background or circumstances. Alexander thought about his own students, the wealthy children whose parents paid enormous fees for private lessons, who treated piano as just another item on their resume. He realized that he had never seen the kind of pure love for music that Maya was describing. The crowd around Maya had grown larger as word spread about her identity. But instead of treating her like a celebrity, people seemed to regard her with something approaching reverence. Here was someone who had achieved the highest levels of success and had chosen to give it all up to serve others. Finally, Alexander found the courage to approach Maya directly. The crowd parted slightly as he walked forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone. When he reached her, he found that he could barely meet her eyes. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. And more than that, I owe you my gratitude. Tonight you showed me something I've been missing my entire career. Maya looked at him with genuine kindness, free from any trace of judgment or superiority. Music isn't a competition, Alexander. It's a gift we're meant to share. When you understand that you won't need my lessons or anyone else's, you'll have everything you need right here, she said, placing her hand gently over her heart. As Maya finally made her way toward the exit, Alexander stood watching her go, knowing that his life as a musician would never be the same.